All right, so in our last section of notes, we talked about federalism, and we talked about how federalism was the division of power between our national government and our state governments. And we talked about some of the powers that each had, and also some of the powers that were denied to each government. So we talked about, the national government and how it has expressed powers, inherent powers, implied, exclusive. We talked about how states have reserved powers according to the 10th Amendment. We talked about the concurrent powers that states and the national government share. We talked about the Supremacy Clause and how the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that federal laws trump state laws because, again, the Constitution is our foundation. It is what we follow. It is what we live by. So in this section of notes, which are called the national government in the 50 states, we're going to talk about the ways in which the national government is obligated to cooperate with states or assist states in time of need. We're also going to talk a little bit about cooperative federalism as well, and understand that this relationship between the national government and the 50 states at times is a complicated relationship. There can be conflict at times. However, cooperation is absolutely necessary in order for our government to be effective. All right, so the national government's obligations to the states. First and foremost, they have to provide a republican form of government. After the Civil War, states or southern states, some of them refused to give African Americans their rights, specifically voting rights. They refused to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which, remember, the 13th Amendment eliminated slavery. The 14th Amendment gave African Americans citizenship, also outlined the ways in which you can become a citizen. And then 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. And because some of these southern states refused to ratify these amendments, the national government refused to recognize them as states, and also refused to admit senators and representatives from those states as well. So, obviously, eventually, they ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then they were recognized as states. So this is just one of the first obligations the national government has for its states. Second, protect states from invasion or internal disorder. An attack on one state is an attack on all 50 states. So obviously, if a state is to be invaded, the military, the national military, also known as the federal force, would be sent in to protect that state. And that's something that the national government is obligated to do. This is for many reasons, but most importantly because the states don't have the power to declare war if they are invaded. We leave that power to Congress. And so if we aren't going to give them the ability to declare war on, the foreign country that potentially could invade, then that's not really fair. So the national government will step in if a state is invaded. And again, if one state's invaded, it's basically like all 50 are being invaded. Our country is being invaded. The federal force typically gets involved. Again, if a foreign country invades, they will also assist the state if the governor kind of asks for assistance. They also can calm internal conflicts. So an example of this would be in 1967, President Johnson sent the army into Detroit to control the riots. We also see national governments assist state governments with national disasters. The government stands ready to aid stricken areas like Hurricane Katrina, and then most recently, Hurricane Harvey, Maria. And so in those times, if the state governments can't handle the situation, which at a lot of times it's hard to, then the national government will step in and assist. Third, respect legal existence and the physical boundaries of each state. And so this just basically declares that no state can be deprived of equal representation in the U.S. Senate without its own consent. Okay, admitting new states. So Congress has the power to admit new states. States cannot be created by taking territory from an existing state without the consent of the legislature. And only 5 states were created from existing states, and that was Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maine, and West Virginia. All right, so admission procedure. Let's start off here with the Enabling Act. So Congress directs people to draft a state constitution. Second, people in the state vote on the Constitution. And then third, if Congress still agrees to statehood after reviewing the document, it creates state by passing this act, the Act of Admission. And then lastly, the President signs the act. The state enters the Union. Congress may also set conditions to be met for admission. So an example, Utah was admitted on conditions that its Constitution outlaw polygamy, the practice of having more than one spouse at a time. Another example would be the southern states that we talked about following the Civil War that refused to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Basically, Congress said you're not going to be admitted to the Union until you ratify those amendments. So again, states that enter the Union, Congress can set conditions that have to be met for admission. So basically, again, Congress will ask the state or the people in that state to draft a constitution. People in the state will vote on the Constitution to make sure they all agree with the way that it is laid out. And then if Congress likes what they see, they'll pass it with the Act of Admission. The President will sign off on it. And again, they might set some terms in order for admission to take place. All right, so now we're going to talk about grants, or grants that can be used to assist state governments, and typically these are given by the national government. So this is money given for a specific, closely defined purpose. School lunches, construction of airports, or wastewater treatment plants. An example, your parents say you can have $50 to go see Marley and Me and eat at Applebee's. So again, a categorical grant is when a state asks the national government for funds, but they have to be extremely specific about what they're going to use that money for, or they could potentially not get the money. So with this type of grant, a lot of times there's strings attached. Again, they have to explain to the federal government the specific purpose involved. They have to make their own monetary contribution, often matching the amount, provide agency to administer the grant, obey a set of guidelines tailored to the particular purpose for which the monies are given. So an example that I can think of would be your Chromebooks. So in order for us to get a grant in order to purchase Chromebooks for each one of you, there were certain defined things that we had to do in order to get the grant. We had to use Schoology. Most of the teachers here have done training on Schoology and have had to use it. If they have had the training, that was one of the qualifications. We had to decide whether we are going to allow them to take cases home or not. We had to decide if we were going to allow you to take them home or if we were going to have you store them here, like in carts, like we kind of did last year for some classes. So again, there were certain qualifications, and we had to explain what we were going to be doing, what was our procedure if we were going to be given the grant. Also understand that there are actually 3 types of grants, and they could also be called grant-in-aids, and they are categorical grant, which we just talked about, so very specific, and then block grants, and then also project grants. So block grants, this is when money is given for a much more broad purposes. So typically these are given for education. The states and local governments get to decide if they want to spend the money on school lunches, hiring teachers, technology in the classroom. They don't have to be very specific. They can just say, we want it for education. So an example of this, your parents give you money for the weekend and you get to decide exactly how you want to spend it. You don't have to tell them exactly what you're going to be doing, like you did with a categorical grant. States prefer these types of grants just as you would, obviously. Another example would be of a block grant would be healthcare, social services, or welfare. These aren't very specific things. Project grants, grants that are made to states, localities, and sometimes private agencies that apply for them. The Department of Health and Human Services make many project grants through its National Institutes of Health. An example would be to support scientists engaged in research on cancer, diabetes, neurological disease, and other medical issues. Revenue sharing. This was in place from 1972 to 1987. The federal government shared federal tax revenue with states and local governments. Only string attached was the money could not be spent on any program in which discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin, age, religious belief, or physical disability was evident. Other forms of federal aid, national agencies help state and local agencies. An example, the Army and Air Force help train each state's National Guard unit, and FBI gives extensive help to state and local police. So in some cases, the state will aid the national government. So, for example, a state law enforcement agency may hold a person wanted for federal charges. So it's important that you understand that cooperative federalism is actually those grant and aids, because cooperative federalism is like a marble cake. It's a federal system with considerable sharing between national, state, and local governments. There is mixing. And essentially with grant and aids, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the national government and the state government kind of working with one another. Key ingredient of the marble cake then, again, is grant and aid programs. And just as in review, funds given by the federal government to state and local governments for specific programs are grant and aids. And so if we look at this picture here, it kind of shows the difference between cooperative federalism and then dual federalism. So dual federalism is kind of where we were pre-1930s. And then in the 1930s, FDR comes along with the New Deal, and that's when we start seeing a shift towards cooperative federalism, where we see categorical grants, project grants, competitive applications, we see formula grants, and things like that, Medicaid. And then 1966 to present, we're seeing this new federalism that has block grants, local, state. We see broad areas of focus, example, public safety. And so it's just really important that you understand that shift from dual federalism to more towards cooperative federalism, and then later on towards the new federalism. The dual federalism here, this is based on clear distinctions between our local, state, and federal governments, and the fact that they, don't really mix. And again, when FDR came in with his New Deal in the 1930s, we started to see some real mixing between local, state, and federal powers.